And so this spring, we went down to Levitt down towards Philly for opening day of baseball for our nephews. And so it was a whole big grand thing. And so it was opening day for the entire league. They had everyone there, all the way from t-ball to baseball to softball. Every age was involved in it, and it was just a whole big opening ceremony. And so they had DJs, concessions, and like the biggest. I'm going to sound really old here for any of the kids that are in the room. Like they had merchandise. Like when I played Little League Baseball, my teams didn't have a merchandise, right? Right. But anyways, but being such a large event, we had parked some distance away, and so as we were walking to the main field where all the main festivities were, we passed by this gigantic, this big storage trailer that had the league mascot. And so the entire league had one mascot. That's how they can get away with the merchandise. But had this big storage trailer that had the mascot painted on the side of it. And so as we walked past it, like we took a moment to check it out and then continued on our way. And as we're getting there, because we had to get the boys with their teams so that they could get set up and do all of that. It was a quick couple of seconds until we realized that Quinn was no longer with us. And so we turned around, and she was standing in front of this trailer just staring at this gigantic outlaw that's painted on the big trailer. Right, and we yelled at her, like, Quinn, hurry up and get up here, right? Because there's a bunch of people. It's a new place, right? So there's all those fears that come with a new place and all of that. And it's like, Quinn, we want you with us. We have somewhere to be. And she turned around and she said, but I want to look at this really neat picture. Right, and there's a couple lessons from that. There's the lesson of, take the time to stop and smell the roses. Right, but as the first lesson that popped into my mind was everybody always has a really good excuse as to why the rules don't apply to them. Right? She thought that standing there to look at this gigantic picture was a good enough reason to not obey the rules. Right? And everybody's got a really good excuse as to why everybody else has to follow the rules, but they don't. Right, and so this series, right, we're looking at stories, right? We're looking at collecting stories, and I open there with a story just to illustrate the point of of how people can be selfish and how we the way that we interpret rules and obedience but we're looking at the power of our stories, right? We're looking at the power of our story, right, to illustrate what God is doing, one in history, but two just in our lives. We're looking at how powerful those stories can be, right? Because we are in a war. Right, we are in a battle. We are at war for hearts and minds, and in the war for hearts and minds, stories win hearts. If you're taking notes and you want to write something down, I got a real quick little ditty for you. Facts inform, stories transform. Right, and so for those of us in here that are super analytical, super logical people, where we think that if you just give somebody enough of the right information that they'll change their mind, no, that's actually wrong. It tends to do the exact opposite. There's a weird, I forget what, it's connected to confirmation bias, but it's something else. But there's a weird thing that happens that the more facts that you give somebody to prove them wrong, the deeper that they actually drives them into their preconceived belief. Right? And so facts inform, but stories transform. Right? And we're in the battle for hearts and minds. And so just the stories of what God is doing in our life. They have power, right? And the more personal the story is to us, the more power that the story has. Okay? And so, right, because as we share, right, as I share the goodness of what God is doing in my life, right, like, if it's a story about me, it carries more weight than if it's a story about somebody else. Right? And the more recent the story is, the more weight that it carries. But the trouble is that sometimes it doesn't really matter how great our story is. Right? It doesn't matter if we can get up and orate with the skill of Shakespeare, right, or the drama of Shakespeare. Sometimes it doesn't matter how dramatic and how great our story is, just people don't want to listen to it. Right? We were doing after work camp. Last afternoon of work camp, we come back here, we clean up, and we were doing karaoke in here. And as I learned in karaoke, singing one of Taylor Swift's songs, "The hater's gonna hate, 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 hate." Right? Like just people are gonna hate. Right? And so what do we do? Right? What do we do when it doesn't matter how great our story is, people just don't want to listen? Right? John chapter 8. Is where we're going to be at this morning here. And so we're looking at a man that was born blind that Jesus healed and restored his sight. I'm sorry, John chapter 9 is where we're going to be. And so John, same book of the Bible we were in last week. If you want to open your Bibles to follow along, John 9 is between Luke and Acts. And so Luke, John, Acts in the New Testament there, if you want to open them up or turn them on to follow along. And so sometimes, right, just it doesn't matter how great our story is, just people aren't going to believe. About 20 years ago, I was at a conference for church planting. And one of the church planters, one of the pastors there, was talking about the prayer walks that his church had done, that his church plants had done. And so he's just telling stories about some of the things that they had managed to achieve, about at least one strip club that they had managed to get shut down just simply by praying and walking around it. There were quite a few different drug dens, just abandoned buildings that had become homes for drug dealers and people doing drugs. And so they just working through the community and praying. And so these things that had happened because they worked and they took the time to pray. And so as he's telling these stories, he's also telling other stories about telling these stories. And he tells us of this one event where he was telling some more of these stories about the power of prayer and the things that had happened in their community because they took the time to pray. And they were fantastic stories. But there was one young man at the crowd at one of these events that just pulled him aside or interrupted him and said, he says, all of that stuff about prayer seems really magnificent. He says, but how do you know that prayer actually works? He says, how do you know that these aren't just a bunch of coincidences? Right? To which the pastor responded, he said, you know what? He said, maybe you're right. Maybe they are just coincidences. What I do know is that when I pray, coincidences happen. Right? But the thing is, right, like it didn't matter how many of those stories the pastor told, that young man didn't want to hear about the power of prayer. Right? And sometimes it doesn't matter. Right? And so what do we do? So John chapter 9 here, as we're going to spend some time looking at Jesus. Jesus here is in Jerusalem for what's known as the Festival of Shelters. It's the festival that leads up to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The Festival of Shelters is actually getting ready to start in a couple weeks. And so it's right around this time of the year. Jesus is in Jerusalem. And so as they're in Jerusalem, they find a man who had been born blind. And so the disciples ask Jesus, why was this man born blind? They ask him, whose sin caused this man to be born blind? Was it his or his parents? And Jesus informs them that the reason that bad things happen is a lot more complicated than that. It's not as simple as just because somebody did a bad thing and now they're blind because of it. And he says, actually, what you're going to see is this man was born blind not because of anybody's sin, but actually what you're going to see is the power of God displayed in his life and at work here. And so Jesus proceeds to spit on the ground, and he makes some mud, puts it over the blind man's eyes, and he tells him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash his eyes. And so just a really neat thing about the Pool of Siloam, real quick. I got a text message from Danny Bretzman Wednesday or Thursday about the Pool of Siloam. And actually about 20 years ago, they were doing some digging, laying new pipe in Jerusalem, and they accidentally discovered the Pool of Siloam. And so they've spent the last 20 years excavating it, and they're getting ready to start opening parts of it to the public to be able to actually see this pool. And so it was really, really just a neat little thing that connected to the sermon here. And so I encourage you just to Google it and look it up. It was just a really neat read. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of other tangents running through my head. I'm sorry. Right, so Jesus tells him to go wash in the pool. And so the man obeys, and he goes and he washes the mud from his eyes, and immediately he can see. Right, and so as he's walking around now and he can see people who begin to recognize him, and they're like, wasn't this the man who was born blind? And there's still some people that just don't want to believe, and so they're like, no, that it's not the man, it was just a guy who looks a lot like him, right, who happens to be able to see, and they were divided on it. And so there's this curious thing here, where verses 13 and 14, there's this thing that happens here. It says that they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus made the mud and healed him. Right? Like they've literally just witnessed a miracle. Like they've known this man to be blind his entire life, and they've literally just witnessed a miracle, but their reflex, their first response is not amazement or curiosity, it's judgment, because it was the Sabbath. Like, that blows my mind. 5 years ago, I was up at church camp. It was my first year as director at 8th grade camp. And it was Thursday night. I know it was Thursday night because it was consecration night. And lights out is 10:30. And so one thing that we always stress to the kids is lights out does not mean that I start brushing my teeth at 10:30. Lights out means my head is on the pillow, the lights are being turned off at 10:30. Right? Like they don't seem to connect that. We have to stress that to them. Right? And so lights out is 10:30, and it's a little beyond lights out, and there is a pile of commotion going on up in the boys' dorm. And so there's a couple counselors come down and tell me that I need to go upstairs and see what's going on. And so I walk upstairs with all of the authority of little bunny foo-foo, getting ready to pick up some field mice and bop them on the head, right? And so I head upstairs, getting ready to like lay down the law, and they see me come up, and they know why I'm up there, and they send me to the room, and there's this one young man in this room, and all of the commotion is because of him. This young man had showed up to church camp angry, incredibly angry at life, incredibly angry at the world. He had been abused by his father at a very early age, and he had the scars on his back to prove it. The commotion was because he had given his life to Christ just 2 hours before that. And when he got to the room to get ready for bed and took his shirt off, the scars were gone. Like, I didn't know how to respond to that, right? Like I was in awe, right? And everybody else in the room was in awe. And the counselor looked at me. He's like, I saw them myself. Those scars were there this morning, right? And like I didn't know what to do with that, but I knew what I wasn't gonna do: yell at them for being up past lights out, right? And here are the Jews, right, in a similar situation, have witnessed a miracle, and their greatest concern is the fact that it's Sabbath, the fact that they're up past lights out. Right? And so like that blows my mind. And so they take him to the Pharisees. Right, and so for the man born blind, right, Jesus has just changed his life, and he's about to come face to face with a bunch of people who don't care. Right? The Pharisees asked the man, right? They asked the man about it. So he told them, Right? He says that Jesus put the mud over, or he doesn't even know that it's Jesus. Right? He says, the man put the mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. And some of the Pharisees said, well, this man Jesus is not from God, for he's working on the Sabbath. And others said, well, how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there's this deep division of opinion among them. And so they're divided over this. And so they continue to question the man. And so they ask the man, well, like, what about your opinion? What is your opinion on the matter? Who do you say he is? Just a piece of advice. Generally speaking, anywhere that you go, if somebody asks you for your opinion, it's a trap. Right? The vast majority of people that you run into, they don't honestly want your opinion because they need your opinion. They want your opinion because they want to argue with you. And so if somebody asks you for your opinion, it's a trap. And sure enough, same thing here. They're asking the man who was just healed for his opinion, and it's a trap. Right? Like, Jesus just healed his lifelong blindness. Like, Jesus has his vote. Right? He's like, Jesus just transformed my life. He has my vote. Right? But that isn't good enough. They continue to doubt. Right? Well, it's obvious that this man could see, so maybe he was just never even born blind. So they go and they get the man's parents. Right? And the parents show up and they're like, no, we can confirm for you. Yes, this is our son. Yes, he was born blind. As far as why he can see now, he's an adult. Ask him. And even that continues to blow me away. Right? Just stay with me on this. Right? Like we began with just disbelief of half the crowd. But now we're so personal all the way down to this man's parents, right, who have raised him, right? So if they're calling him a man, that means at a minimum he's 12 years old, right, to be able to get that title, right? So he's at least that old. So for at least these many years, they've cared for him. They've maybe been like his only source of comfort, right, has been the sound of their voice. Right? And so now he's at a point where he can see. And not only can he hear his parents' voice, but he's actually be able to see his parents, the ones that love him, the ones that raised him, the ones that have taken care of him. And the first time that he sees them, what he gets from them is rejection. Right? The first thing that he gets from them is, he's an adult, ask him. Even they don't want to hear his story. Like, that's how great the pressure of the crowd is. That's how great the pressure of the Pharisees is. Right? But in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all of the anger of everything that's going on around them, right, in the midst of all of the danger and the crowd and everything that's going on, right, he's surrounded by men who claim to be smarter than him. Right? These men, they claim to have a better understanding of the scriptures than he does. They claim to have a better understanding of the traditions than he does. All of this plays out in the story. Right? Some of these accusations don't come till a little bit later in the story. Right? And notice I say they claim. Right? They claim to have a better understanding. Right? So all of these things are happening. Right? And the man who was just healed says, listen. He's like, I don't know about any of that. I don't know whether Jesus is a sinner or not, but I know this. I was blind and now I can see. He says, of absolutely everything that you're claiming, of absolutely everything that you're yelling and you're screaming and you're telling me, he's like, I don't know about any of that, but I know this. He changed my life. So what do you want me to do with that? This is that, how do you know that all of those things that you pray for aren't just coincidences? You know what? I don't. But I know that when I pray, coincidences happen, so I'm going to keep praying. Right? Or, right? Like this is why your story is so important. Right? Because the only thing in this that carries any weight is the fact that this man was blind and now he can see. Right? Because as you tell somebody else's story, right? They can argue against that. Right? And you're going to run into people who claim that you don't understand the scriptures properly, you're not using them properly, you don't understand history properly, you don't understand traditions properly, right? You don't have the proper degree on the wall to be able to argue about those things. You're going to run into people who are going to throw all of those same accusations against you. But when it's your story, they can't do anything about it. Because it happened to you. Right? Just on a real quick aside, right? That's why it's so tough to refute the people who claim that they've seen Bigfoot personally. Right? Or the people that say that they've personally seen a UFO. Right? You can't argue if they claim that it personally happened to them. Right? It's just real quick, it just amazes me that we've gotten to the point where, we've got 30 million megapixels on our cameras, but the pictures of Bigfoot still come out just as grainy as they did 50 years ago. So, but that's just, anyways. Right, but this is why your story is so important. So what do we do, though? Jesus ran into this multiple times, and he gives the same response every single time. Right? There were towns where Jesus wasn't able to do any miracles because of their lack of faith. And he and his disciples just picked up and went to a place where he would be received. There was a time where Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem and he was walking through Samaria again. Right? The same place where last week we were looking at the woman at the well. And so he's walking through the same area of Jerusalem. Only this time they didn't welcome him. And the disciples wanted to call down fire from heaven and burn the town. And Jesus rebuked his disciples and he said, no, we'll just move on to the next town. It'll be okay. And he even instructs his disciples when they're headed out to do their own ministry. He tells them, he's like, if you're going to go to a place and people don't want you, they aren't going to receive you, they aren't going to want to hear about me, they aren't going to want to hear your story, don't get angry about it. Just pick up your piece. Right? You take your peace with you and just move on to the next town. Right? And so this blind man, right? Yeah, and so just move on. This week in our story, in our journal here, we're looking at the goodness of God. And so remember that the purpose of this journal is to help us document our story. Right, and so I didn't realize that I would open up a whole can of worms by making a joke about beer at the beginning, and so as Jay had his own testimonies to share, and then Roy had his testimony to share, and I won't share any of mine, right? And so, but like this is about like Roy talked about the journey of his guitar, right, from the bar room to leading worship. Right? And this is about just recording that journey, right? And some of those events along the way, right? And how those things have changed your life or changed the life of the guitar, or maybe just to testify to some of that journey, his wife may have a whole lot more to say about that than he does, right? And so that's what this is about. Right, and so this week, as we're looking at the goodness of God, there's two different layers to that. And so as we work through this journal here this week, there's the distant part of our journey where it's looking into our past and seeing the goodness of God, right, and the major events that we have in our lives where we can point to and say God was good. And he has blessed us, and he's been at work in our lives. But it's also working at a more recent level of just looking at today, right? And just how is God good to me today? Right? And so as we do this, I have a couple things for you guys. And so, if this is your first Sunday, if you weren't here last week, you're going to want to grab one of these journals, and I would encourage you to take the time to listen to last week's sermon, as just kind of I introduce the journal and where things are going, and take the time to just kind of pick up wherever it is that you feel you want to. My biggest rule last week was, if you're participating in this, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. All right, and so that's my biggest encouragement in this. And so, but just have a few things to keep in mind as we head into this week, right? Just with recording our story. And that is, one, is please understand that as we're trying to identify the goodness of God in our life, that does not mean that we will never experience tragedy. Right? That does not mean that we will never experience bad things in this life. Right? But God has made us a promise, right? That he works all things for the good of those who love him, who are working according to his will. Right? And so he hasn't promised to protect us from bad things, but he has promised to use those bad things for good. Right? And so I grew up in a household when I was 12. My youngest brother was born. My youngest brother was born special needs. He is 26 years old, operates at about the level of a 9-month-old. And so if you could imagine having a 100-pound 9-month-old caring for him for 26 years, that's where my parents are at right now. Right? And so that right, like we didn't ask for that, right? And that creates problems. When we were still allowed to do sports, but it limited how my parents could be involved in sports. Humble brag, I ran track. My senior year, I was the captain of the track team, the MVP of the track team, had an undefeated regular season. Right, and so it was just, I remember, right, one track meet we went to was an invitational, and there was one guy warming up, and he's like, visualize the win, right? He's doing that, and as he's warming up, he turns around and he sees me and he recognizes me, and he goes, visualize second place, visualize, right? Just because he knew, right? Like, my mom would come to my track meets. She would watch one event and then go home. She couldn't stay for the entire track meet because she had to be home to care for my brother. Right? Like even to this day, right, we don't have a normal life where if we want to go to dinner, we call up my in-laws and we say, hey, you want to meet us at such and such a place for dinner? And they say, yes. We can't do that with my parents because they have to take care of my brother. Right? And so, right, it doesn't mean that we will never experience bad things in this life, but God will bring good from it. Having a brother like that sets your perspective as a child. Right? You learn what's actually important in life, and you don't whine as much as the other teenagers do. It forces you to grow up in a way that other teenagers don't. By the time that I got to youth ministry, we had quite a few special needs kids in our youth ministry. And so from legitimately handicapped to even just autism, right? And we're even at a point, where we've got some autistic kids within our church. And I know work camp Sunday, I think it was, if you guys remember, as I was talking about work camp, like I had to pause in the middle of my sermon because one of the kids was up here behind me creating problems, right? Which please understand me, when I pause in the middle of my sermon, I am not angry that the kid is here. I'm pausing to give the parent permission to come get their child, right? Because I know, because sometimes that happens and mom and dad don't want to interrupt me, and so they're just praying to God that the child comes back, right? Right? Well, he has not been medically diagnosed yet, but I'd bet my entire reputation on the fact that he's autistic, right? And so that means that life in this church is going to be exciting as long as he's a part of it. Right, and so, but we talk about just treating them like they're normal people. It's actually natural for me because I have a brother who has special needs, and so for me, it's just completely natural to just bring those kids in and just treat them like they're my brother. Right, where I recognize that not everybody has that ability. Right, and so, right, my family has this. We don't even call it, it's not even a tragedy, right? But because my brother is in our lives, we are better for it. And he's brought good to our lives. God has brought good to our ministry, right? And so finding the goodness of God in our lives does not mean that we will never experience a bad thing. It does not mean that we will never experience tragedy. But he promises to bring good from it. He promises to bring fruit from it. And so just a couple things as we do this. As you're looking for the goodness of God in your life, one, don't covet. Comparison is the thief of joy. Right? And so stop comparing yourself to other people and the things that they have. Be generous. The more that you give, the more that God will respond in you. The more generous that you are to others, the more generous that God will be with you. Be humble. Maybe one of the reasons you're struggling to find the goodness of God in your life is because you're taking credit for the things that he deserves. And so be humble. And be content. God has promised to provide our needs. But sometimes our definition of a need is different than what his definition of a need is. And so be humble. And the last thing, I want to stress it again, be bold. Comfort zones are killers. The more time that you spend outside of your comfort zone, the easier that it's going to be to find God at work in your life. Also realize that promise to work all things for the good of those who love him according to his will. It's directly tied to those who are working inside of his will. His will generally lies outside of our comfort zones. Right? So just a few things to keep in mind as we head into this week and we seek the goodness of God in our lives. Right? Because we want to document it. So when Jesus heard all of this, he found the blind man, and he asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The blind man responded, "Who is he? I want to believe in him." Jesus says, "You've seen him. I am him." And the man believed. Jesus changed his life. Then Jesus offered this. He says, "I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think that they see that they are blind." Heard a really neat story this week, and it's not my story. It's one I saw on social media. A guy was talking about his kids. He took his kids to see the new Guardians of the Galaxy of the movie. So this was about 6 months ago. And so they went to see the late showing. So like the 11 o'clock start time. And his youngest son was like 7 or 8 years old. And so, yeah, they were out late, but it was just like that's what made the event so special, to be with Dad out that late. And so, plus, he wasn't worried about it, though, because he knew his 7-year-old was going to sleep through the entire movie. Right? And so the movie comes on, and they're started, and he looks down at his 7 years old, and he's surprised to see that his 7-year-old is still awake. And his 7-year-old just got glasses. Right? And so he has his glasses, and he's doing this with his glasses. Watching the movie. And Dad says, "What are you doing?" And he's like, this is amazing. I can actually see the movie. And Dad says, "What do you mean you can actually see the movie?" He says, "If you couldn't see the movie, why didn't you tell anyone?" And he said, "Because I didn't know. I just thought that's the way that everybody saw." Right? There's a pile of blind people out there who are blind and may not even know it. Somebody needs to tell them that they're blind. This young man didn't know that he was blind until, one, somebody told him that he was blind, and then two, they went to the doctor, and the doctor showed him how much better his life could be. And that's what your story is, right? Your story is the illustration to show other people how much better their life can be. Not everybody is going to want a part of it. Some people are going to be stubborn, and they're going to tell you, "I don't need glasses. I can see just fine." But somebody is going to want to hear it. But they need somebody to tell them that they're blind. And if you're not going to tell them, then who will? Right? Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you. Lord, I thank you for what it is that you do in our lives, Lord. Just to be able to stop and look and just testify to your goodness. Right? We looked at a story this morning about a man, just a very obvious thing, right? Just he was born blind and now he could see. Like, it doesn't get a whole lot more obvious than that, right? Maybe to be dead and now I'm alive, right? Like, this may be the only thing that tops that. Right? And unfortunately, nobody wanted to hear it, not even his own parents. Lord, and that's tough. That's heartbreaking. That's what the pressures of this world can do. Especially when it's the people in control, it's the people that are in charge, it's the loudest voices, it's the most powerful voices that don't want to hear or see anything of it. Lord, but I pray for us this week. Lord, as we continue to gather these stories of your goodness, Lord, this evidence that's in our lives that you are here and you are good. Lord, and as we do this, right, there are going to be other people, like as we praise you, right, for the fact that, right, like cancer tumors are shrinking. And people are going to respond and they're going to say, yeah, but even people who don't know Jesus, their cancer tumors are shrinking as well. It's like, yeah, but I'm going to give God the credit for the medical technology that we have so that even the non-believers can be blessed from it. You've been good to us. I pray, Lord, as we take time to document it, that you would continue to make yourself obvious. Lord, that we would give you the credit that you deserve, that if it's a heart change in us that needs to be seen so that we can see you better, that we would be both humble and courageous, Lord, to step into that change so that we can see you better, hear your spirit better, Lord. And then maybe, just maybe, you might be gracious enough to us this week to provide someone who's blind so that we can begin to tell them our story. So we can begin to tell them how you've changed our life, how you've been good to us, the power of your word, your scriptures in our lives, the difference that it's making, Lord. And we might see the blessings that come with taking a step outside of our comfort zone and giving your spirit an opportunity to work. I just pray this, Lord Jesus, in your name. Amen.